Welcome to Pep Talk, where we discuss the state of Texas real estate market as it relates to property taxes. Here's your host, Paul Pennington.
It's my great pleasure to have my good friend Lynn Krebs here again. He's with the Texas A&M Research Center.
Real estate research.
Real estate research. Tell everybody what y'all
Sure.
do at the Real Estate Research Center.
Yeah, we're the Texas Real Estate Research Center at Texas A&M University in College Station. And we have a team of research economists and a team of researchers that focus on pretty much all aspects of real estate, from commercial to housing and rural land, and then just the economy, all the, what am I trying to say, macroeconomic issues and such that affect various aspects of real estate, like finance and capital markets and that kind of thing.
Are y'all involved at all with the education that the realtors get, or is that separate?
We are, actually. In fact, I'm glad you asked that question because it ties into what we do. The Real Estate Research Center, where I'm at, was founded by the Texas legislature, act of the legislature, before they decided to put it, at Texas A&M. They did, they just create the concept. And the funding mechanism for our center is not tuition, like you might think, since we're at a university. It's actually a portion of broker and realtor fees when they renew their license. By legislation, since 1970 something, that is how we're funded. And so our job is to do research that serves the real estate community, and that's why you can find so much, information, research reports, as well as tons of data.
What is the magazine that I get? Like
Tierra Grande.
That's great.
You get that? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I like that. That's got some good
so
stuff.
So the licensees receive that. That's right. And slightly delayed, it's available for everybody in digital version on our website, but realtors receive that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this is our third year,
right?
And where have we been in the last 2 years? Where have we been? I'm trying to think. When we did it the first time, what were interest rates? Was that 2 years ago?
Yeah. So 2 years ago, in the fall, the Fed was in the middle of their hiking cycle, right? So rates were coming up.
Okay.
They hadn't reached their peak yet, but they're on the way up. Yeah.
So we've gone through the people that watch the Fed and are interested in financial news, know the journey we've been on and the increases in the Fed rate and the effects it's had on everything.
Right.
It's real expensive if you're purchasing a home. It's a lot more expensive if you're purchasing a car. Anything.
Right.
Credit card.
Right.
Rates. I mean, just everything.
Yep. Right.
The rates if you're into building single family residential, if you're into a commercial building, those rates are high. So we've been through all that.
Yeah.
And we've had different episodes that we've done and talked about everything that's happened in the last 2 years. Now, where did they have their little mini summit last week? Where was that?
Jackson Hole.
Jackson Hole.
Yeah.
So everybody was listening to what the chairman was saying, and my impression is everybody's walking away and that the Fed will cut rates at their September meeting.
Right.
The impression I got from everybody, it's probably going to be 25 basis points.
Right.
And some other people are saying it could be 50.
Right.
And that so now they're going to, and the impression I'm getting from everything I'm reading is that the Fed rate over the course, say, of a year, and I don't know if that's true, they might reach 200 basis points. I don't know. Somebody said that, or I read it. So we have that. So here we sit in late August 2024. Let me ask you this, if they cut the Fed rate 25 basis points in their February or September meeting, what would the public and business community, what would the effect be on them when that cut comes?
Yeah. That's a difficult question to answer, but I think we got a glimpse of it a week or so ago when we got that really bad employment report and we had a really down stock market day. The bond rate went much below 4 for the first time in years. And,
okay, when the bond rate sinks like that, what is that telling the public?
Well, so that's indicating that we're expecting lower rates in the future. So I'm talking specifically about the 10-year bond, which is generally the one that
Right.
tracks with mortgage rates and so on. And the reason I bring that up is because we also saw, if you looked at bankrate.com, national survey of mortgage rates, 30-year rate was getting down, well below 7, almost to 6.5 national average. Now that's a big drop. That didn't all happen right then, but I'm just saying that pushed that down. It's come back up a little bit since then because we've had some more positive news and stuff like that, and so that's going to kind of bounce around. But to answer your question, that's where it's going.
I've always wondered this question about bonds. So the bond market, if they think interest rates are going to continue to go up, the bond market would go up. Is that fair?
Yeah, right. The yield on the bond would go up.
And so, but if they think we're headed for cuts in interest rates and or a slowdown and or a recession,
right,
bond rates come down.
Correct. Generally speaking.
Okay.
Generally speaking.
Okay.
There are some exceptions to that, but that's correct. And so what they're really looking at is what do they think the rate is going to be over that bond's life cycle? In the 10-year, they're looking at, well, even though, because think about it this way, right now the Fed funds rate's, roughly 5.3, excuse me, the Fed funds rate. We might want it to be 2 point something, but it's really 5.3 right now. And the 10-year bond, which the mortgage rate tracks, is well below that. And so there's generally that spread between the two and the 10-year bond below that. And so as the Fed funds rate comes down, they're not one for one by any means because there's other risk factors involved. And I don't know if you want to go there yet, but as I think about where you're going, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is the last 2 times we've had rate cutting cycles, the Fed has gone all the way to 0. And
why would they? I mean, barring it's the end of the world,
right.
We have to do it.
Right.
Why is there even? I'm under the impression that, from what I see and read, that when they're done cutting, it's going to be the Fed rate's going to be 3.25 or 3.5, and that's it.
Right. It's what they call the neutral rate. When you get to that neutral rate, what's it going to be?
When you look into your crystal ball, are we done with going to 0?
Well, I think that there's a good possibility that we're done with going to 0. I mean, in other words, where I'm driving at is I don't think they're going to go, below 2 in the near, next 5 years. I mean, obviously a lot strange catastrophic events, black swan events, whatever, could change that. But assuming, typical patterns and stuff, so I don't think we're going back to 0.
If they settled on 3.2, they do 200 basis points.
Right.
We're at basically 3.25.
Right.
Is that kind of a normal rate for the Fed?
Well, it depends on how far you want to go back to define normal.
Let's say 20 years.
Yeah, 20 years. That's actually, I think, a little, I'm just imagining the chart in my mind right now, and we can provide a chart to look at that with this podcast. But I think that that's a little bit high, I want to say, even over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
You got to think about, for over 10 years, we had a 0 Fed funds rate in the last 15 years.
Right.
Over 10 years of that was 0 Fed funds rate, which is not good. All things, well, I'm not even going to say all things be equal. There's a lot of things really that go wrong with markets when you have a Fed funds rate at 0.
Well, there's a lot of, I'll put it to you in my uneducated way. When you have cheap money, there's bad deals that get made.
Yes, that's correct. And bad deals that have
bad deals for the full spectrum of business.
All asset
mergers
classes,
and
everything,
acquisitions.
right?
Yes.
And furthermore, you have deals that last longer than they otherwise would have. You have zombie companies, as they're called. They were like the Walking Dead because, if it wasn't for the 0 Fed funds rate, and I want to elaborate on that in just a second. Those companies wouldn't be able to stay in business. The reason I want to elaborate on that is because what I like to look at, just to kind of have a picture of like what does the Fed funds rate mean right now? Like 5.3, we've been at this rate now for a year. What does that mean now versus a year ago? Is it more or less restrictive than it was a year? It's the same rate. Well, the way you answer that question is you look at inflation overall. And so one measure is to what I would call the effective Fed funds rate, which is the Fed funds rate minus CPI, okay, the Consumer Price Index. let's go back to the two periods that add up to over 10 years of zero Fed funds rate. Most of that time, the effective funds rate was less than zero. That's like free money. It's like, why wouldn't you take huge risks because you're playing with the house's money, so to speak?
Right.
You know, I mean, I'm overplaying that a little bit, but the point is that, you know, we had a Fed funds rate that was lower than CPI, you know, and so it was net negative rates. We've never had a negative Fed funds rate in this country, unlike, you know, Japan just started reversing course on that for the first time in a long time. We've never gone there. I hope we never have to go there, or have we never have need to go there, I guess you might call it. But so when you look at the current cycle we're in, you know, you remember when inflation was starting to kick off in 2021, and it was referred to by almost everybody as transitory. And there were logical reasons for why that, you know, was concluded at the time, because of the reopening of the economy and all the funds that were coming in from the federal government, transfer payments, and pent-up savings from income earned where people weren't traveling and shopping and that kind of thing. Well, when you go back to that concept of Fed funds rate minus CPI, we still had a 0% Fed funds rate when CPI was ticking up and up. You know, I don't remember exactly what point it was, but I can tell you this, that the effective funds rate, as I've just defined it, was something like negative 2.5 or negative 3 or more, you know, for a little period of time. And that accelerated that inflation that we saw that bumped up to 9% at its peak, you know, before it started coming back down. And then, you know, the Fed started raising, but not until over a year after the inflation started to kick off.
Well, I think most people, and I could be wrong, but I think most people will agree that the way we addressed the pandemic and the $2 trillion we spent was maybe an overplay.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. Well,
and you know, I think you're going to see. I mean, that's just crippling to any nation. $2 trillion.
It's a lot more than that, Paul.
Okay.
And so
it's worse than that.
I'll show you a chart that shows the total government spending and the bills that were passed starting in 2020 through 2021 and beyond. Not only the CARES Acts and the COVID Acts, but then of course the other stimulus bills. I mean, the reason I'm bringing this up is because whether they were directly or indirectly related to COVID or not, there were excess sort of special bills, the total of that was over $6 trillion.
What was the legislation that offered companies, hey, we're going to pay you? They called it a loan. Here's
payroll protection plan.
Yeah. I mean, think about that. We didn't need that money.
Right.
We never paid that.
A lot of companies didn't need that money.
Okay, and we never paid it back.
Right.
I mean, that's just nuts.
Right. You were forgiven. It was perfectly legal. You know, it's just yours to keep.
Right.
You know, so
it was,
right.
And you see the quantitative effect of just giving that away.
Yeah.
I mean, what they should have done is they should have said, we don't know what the future is.
Right.
We don't know.
Right.
We're going to give you this money. Make sure you keep your guys employed.
Right.
But at some point in time, we're going to maybe ask you to pay the principal back or
Right.
something.
Something. Yeah.
Right. But just to give it.
Right. And unfortunately, there was billions of dollars of fraud in that program as well, and some of the other programs. And in the grand scheme of things, you know, we can debate how much of that was excessive or not. It actually wasn't, you know, the lion's share of the total federal government spending. Because
I know.
You add up the.
I know, but they were giving that to companies, and then they were giving certain taxpayers or non-taxpayers were getting checks.
Yeah.
Here's money to help you with your life.
But all of that stimulated demand, whether it was direct transfer payments to individuals or to businesses in the payroll protection plan or whatever. It was all stimulative and inflationary.
I agree with you, but another contributor to that was the fact that all of our trade systems were frozen.
Yep.
I mean, you wanted something and you couldn't get it.
There were supply chain issues.
Right. So you had that, plus you had this overstimulus,
Yep.
and you got this big mess.
There's one layer to that overstimulus I want to mention that played a big role in it. Do you remember when you couldn't find your pool guy and you couldn't find your lawn guy? You know, you needed something repaired at your house. It was hard to find people.
Right.
People were being paid more not to work. than they would have made working. A lot of people were.
Or what we saw,
Or they use it as an opportunity to retool or change,
we saw people changing jobs
Right,
because they could be here and go there and make more
Exactly,
money. It was
that's
just-
right. So with all that transitioning going on and people being paid more not to work than to work for a period of time, that's why we had, that also added to the inflationary effect of the excess spending.
And I will tell you, in all the real estate that I've seen in my career, since 1979 to today, I never, ever saw a run-up in, I can be specific, in commercial values that I saw. I've told this story a million times. I saw some of my clients who are retail developers, and the old way of doing it is you buy the dirt, then you build whatever you're building it. You get a little bit of history of running it, so that people can analyze it, and then you sell it to somebody else. During that period of time, you bought the dirt, you started building it. When you were at 80%, you weren't even complete.
Right.
You had contracts out the door.
Yeah.
I mean, like 20
Right.
waiting for you.
Right.
And that caused the value of real estate to get distorted. And I've never seen that
Right.
in my entire career. But I digress. So we've talked about the pandemic, and we've talked about the Fed's doing with their rates. Now I'm going to ask you to look into the future.
Okay.
So if you and I come back to this table in August of 2025, okay, where's the economy going to be? Where's employment going to be? What are the like interest rates to buy a home? Where is that going to be? Just interest rate, consumer interest rates. I mean, what do you see in the future?
Yeah. It is impossible for me to really even, I can speculate on some of those big picture items.
Just ask
and
me to
I'll
speculate.
speculate, but I think I don't want to get into politics, but I think a lot does depend on the election because there are very different policies in regards to government programs, and which will be stimulative, inflationary, et cetera. In fact, I was just looking at a chart, which I can share as well, that when you look at you remember back in the 70s and 80s, we had inflation, and the Fed thought they had it under control, and they let off the pressure too soon, and then all of a sudden inflation spiked up in the 70s. So the second peak was much higher than the second, than the first one. I mean, if you were to start that period in 1967, and if you were to look at 2015 as the same sort of, if you overlay those two starting points, the chart on inflation is almost identical in the ups and the downs. From 67, from 15 to 24, so that's 9 years. From 67 to 76, which is 9 years, that looks identical. And we were in a downward pattern at that point, just like we are now with the rate of inflation, the annual rate of inflation. The big question for me is next year, are we going to continue to get that down to 2%, or continue to pull it below 3%, or are we going to see another spike in inflation? There's only so much the Fed can do to try to control these things, right? They don't control all the levers, right? No one entity does, which that's probably a good thing, right? But that's what's so challenging, is because you've got that spending that does in fact impact demand, and it can be inflationary, regardless of what the Fed does.
I think both the candidates are over-promising.
Yeah, I agree.
They're going to spend a lot.
And
of
so that's
money.
why I bring that up, because it's a fear, either way. But that's something to take a look at, is to what degree, and at what point does that become a problem that the Fed can't contain with its tools.
I mean, the election in November is one thing. I think geopolitical stuff is bigger.
Oh, I completely agree.
If something terrible were to happen in Asia,
right?
I mean,
right. So let me make a point about that. One of the reasons why the inflation rate has come down, and core excludes food and energy. If you look at the total inflation,
why do they do that?
Well, because that happened back in that period I was talking about.
I mean,
before.
like if you're talking to a homeowner, you're talking to just ordinary people. Right. I mean, energy and going to the grocery store, that is inflation.
So I'd like to talk about that. But I'll answer your question first of why they did that. They did that back in I think it was the Volcker era, in that second inflationary period I was talking about in the 70s, because they were having a hard time figuring out what was going on, and they said, well, look, Food and energy are too volatile, and they're seasonal. And so let's have a measure that excludes those. And so that's why they came up with core. But I like to look at all of them. I look at core. I look at total. Chairman Powell's actually come up with something called super core. And so it just gets, there's so much stuff. But I'll just make this point. Core goods, which excludes even more. Core goods is down like disinflationary. It's slightly negative at the moment, year over year. Rate of inflation for core goods.
Yeah.
But that excludes food, energy, shelter, housing, and services. So it excludes all four of those. And so, but it's interesting to look at that. It's like core goods really isn't the problem anymore. It's these other things which you can't live without. Certain services you can live without, but as an individual consumer, you can't live without food and shelter, obviously. And those are the biggest things. But one of the reasons why the not core, but the CPI in general has come down is because year over year, fuel prices have come down. So you brought up the Middle East, and that's where I started this whole thought, process, was because that is a big risk. We could see energy prices rising. That was part of the market today. Was worried about that, and so that could create a problem. Again, it won't show up in core CPI, but it's an issue, and it's an issue for producers, right? So it drives up cost of production.
I was thinking, obviously you have the problems that the world is facing right now is the Middle East, Ukraine, and China, the Pacific, Taiwan.
Right. Taiwan.
I was referring to if something terrible were to happen in Taiwan.
Right.
I mean, that could that's China.
Yeah.
And that could cause inflation to go nuts.
Right.
Again. That'd shut your supply chain down.
Let's talk about that for just a minute. Just big picture, hypothetically, if something like that were to happen, and let's say we were to have to ramp up our military industrial complex, that would be stimulative, and it would be federal government spending that we would probably all rally around and support because we've got to protect what we've got. But unfortunately, that's also inflationary, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So this is why I see the next 12, really 2 or 3 years as being really complex challenge for the Fed. Their job is to maintain price stability, which is about the inflation, and full employment is their goal.
Now, answer me this: how do you have all these the government collecting all the data, and then last week they come out, we missed the March number by almost 1 million people being employed.
Yeah.
How do you miss that?
So that was the annualized total they revised down by 818,000, right, nearly 1 million. That's in addition to all the monthly revisions, downward revisions, which of almost every month has had downward revisions. So that's cumulative. So it's, but the annual additional, reduction is 818. What I'm really interested in learning more about, because I've seen a couple things that, make me think I need to dig into this some more. And that is, to your pointed question, the first numbers that come out are based on a survey. And their model, in addition to it being a survey, which is not as reliable as the hard data they get in the employment report, but in the survey, they're relying on responses, but they also have in their model a predictive system for business formations and closures. And I think one of the things that was talked about quite a bit in regards to this recent revision downward is because they overestimated the business formations over the last year. So they're now seeing that, hey, there were fewer businesses created than we would typically have expected, than what we had expected, and that was part of their survey model, right? And so they were wrong about that, and that's part of the reason why they had to pull that back.
The Fed thinks that, to your point, we've gotten inflation, those areas that they measure under control. Okay?
I'm not sure that they feel that they're under control.
It's a lot better than it was.
Exactly. Yeah,
it's on a
definitely,
good.
that's correct.
The projection.
Right.
Is okay. So and they're saying that so we can start easing up on interest rates,
right,
and we can have this soft landing thing. Now, as I recall, the only time there was a soft landing, I think, was in 1995, where all these things happened and it worked out fine.
Right.
When you look into your crystal ball, okay, here's one you got to answer yes or no.
Okay.
In the next 12 months, recession, yes or no? You got to say one.
Yeah, okay.
You got a 50-50 chance.
I would say yes if I was forced to say yes. Now, I think it was it last year or the year before? We had the most anticipated recession in history that didn't really materialize. And that was largely because overall we didn't have 2 negative quarters, but we had a lot of industries that were feeling the effects of recession to them.
There was a
Right.
recession.
There
if you
was,
looked
yeah.
at if
Right.
you got industry specific,
Right.
like
Right. Oh, yeah.
single
No doubt.
family, there was a
Oh
recession.
yeah, that's what I'm referring to.
Yeah. But okay,
Yeah.
so in the next 12 months, maybe a recession.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there are reasons why I think that might not happen.
Okay,
A
all
lot of
right.
reasons, which
All
we
right.
can discuss if you want.
12 months from now,
know.
what is the interest rate if you're going to buy a home?
12 months from now.
You have all those letters behind your name.
Yeah,
so-
well, I'm not a mortgage expert.
Okay.
I only look at that from the lens of the macroeconomic
Okay,
issues
all
and
right.
how they relate. So I'm not in the mortgage industry,
Right.
but just thinking about how they typically work and where I think rates are headed. I think that we're going to be 6%. Maybe
the average
yeah, the
interest
national average
will be
30-year
6%.
fixed. Yeah, maybe a bit below that. But see, the thing is it
Now,
doesn't
let
just
me ask
depend
you-
on the Fed funds rate. It depends on the market's expectation of
Okay.
what comes next.
Got all your
right,
qualifiers.
Right, yeah.
But when I first I've bought homes. I bought homes with hyperinflation. I bought homes. 6% seems like the normal rate.
Yeah, right.
Over the last
Correct.
several decades, isn't it?
Yeah, I think 5 and 6% is a good healthy rate.
Okay.
And by the way, if we do go below 6, I think that market activity will really pick up. I mean, I just anecdotally, when we had that little dip in rates, I was told by a number of people I know in the banking industry that they all of a sudden had a surge in refinance applications, which is a little crazy because we're
Right.
still talking about 6.5, but some banks were offering 6% a few weeks ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that we've done single family. Now, how about like consumer interest rates for cars and things like that? What do you see?
Well, I do see rates still coming down. For example, on credit cards, I was looking at credit card history going back to the early 90s, which that average credit card rate in the early 90s, which was when I was coming out of college and I was familiar with credit card rates, was in the high teens. And now they're, between 21 and 25%. So, that doesn't sound like huge. It's a big difference.
It is.
It's a really high,
Yeah.
and they've started to cool down. But what I really found was interesting in the last year or so, actually it's been more like last 18 months, the rate at which credit card rates went up I've never seen that. You can't find a chart that shows you a pattern like that. The
Really?
gap, the vertical gap between dots, year to year, is or quarter to quarter. I mean, was huge. So, but the Fed funds rate also went up faster than it had ever gone up before.
Right.
They had more consecutive increases in an 11-month period and so on. But in regards to rates, it's funny you say this. My wife had been wanting to buy a new Bronco for a long time, and I kept saying, "Babe, let's wait." These dealers, let's go back 6-12 months. The dealers, they were not wheeling and dealing. They were like, "No, you're paying full.
Right.
We're not getting you." And so I said, I really think things are going to soften up, and I was right. And we just bought her the new Bronco recently, and then I got a text from my local Ford dealer who says, "Hey, you want to trade in your F-150? We are now offering 0% financing, and we've got incentives in place." Well, that's the first time I've heard something like that in a few years, right? So this is a sign, anecdotal evidence, but there are other signs that back this up that are not so anecdotal, that are more hard trends, that while consumer spending still looks pretty good, there's a lot of weakness because credit card debt is, significantly higher.
So where
Rates
do
are
you
higher.
see these in a year?
What-
Where do you see like credit card? Is it going to be in the high teens again 12 months from now?
Again, that's not an area of expertise for me, but yes, I would expect them to come down.
And you would
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
auto loans and things like that
Yeah.
should come down.
Yeah. So I think, and really, it's with those things, it's not so much about the Fed. Like, for example, in this case, Fed hasn't lowered yet, and dealers are already starting to,
Well,
work with you on.
I think if you got 100 economists in a room right now, 99 are saying they're going to cut it in September.
Yeah, yeah.
Would you agree?
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah.
I do agree. I mean, I think Chairman Powell has pretty much already said we're cut. I mean, he didn't say we're cutting it, but he may as well have. He may as well have. So
right.
I think it would be a real shock if he didn't at this point. 3 or 4 months ago, I didn't think he would, but now he's made it clear to me. I mean, the market is convinced.
I'm going to put you on the spot. 12 months from now, what is unemployment?
Again, 12 months is a long time. When we do forecasting models, and I'm specifically do forecasting models on rural land prices in Texas, across Texas, and I can talk your ear off in regards to the run up in those prices and what's happening in that market now across regions in Texas. But I'm sorry, what was your question?
I said, what did I say? I said 12 months from now.
Yeah, 12 months from now, what? Oh, and unemployment.
Unemployment.
Yeah, unemployment. Again, okay, now I know what I was going to say. What I was going to say there is that...
what's unemployment today?
Well, unemployment today is 4.3.
Okay. So
okay, and it ticked up from 4.1, which is a pretty big jump.
Okay,
yeah.
So 12 months from now, let me help you out.
Yeah.
12 months from now, is unemployment going to be hovering around 6?
I would not rule that out. I wouldn't bet a lot of money on it either. There's just so many variables. Let me put it to you this way. The Fed, I think, right now is getting a little bit more concerned about the unemployment rate than they are about inflation. Okay, and that may be a mistake, may not be. I am not saying that that's right or wrong, but they've clearly paid a lot more attention to unemployment. And I think that's a key reason why Powell is more comfortable saying, we're at the point now we're going to start cutting rates.
Let me phrase it a different way. What's kind of normal unemployment in this country? Normal.
Yeah, 4.5% unemployment is considered very normal and healthy.
Okay.
Yeah, and we're still below that, but I think we're going to cross over that before long.
So I think what we've established is you've given all these qualifiers, so no one can sue you.
Yeah. By the way, opinions I express here are my own and not those of the university.
Right. But you see there might be a recession, be a recession.
Right.
You see interest rates on homes and autos and all those things coming down.
Right.
You see unemployment ticking up. I guess the other question is like if there were a recession, since you're kind of tentative about it, you're saying if there is one, it'll be mild. Is that fair?
I would say, the base case would be yes, it would be mild.
Okay.
Right.
Mild.
Yeah.
Now,
I think there's a case that it could be, more than mild, worse than mild.
Now I'm going to ask you a global question.
Yeah.
Real global. The amount of debt that this country has, and when does that come home to roost? I mean, like, when does it get to the point where you're going you're going to have to go to the public and say, not only are you not going to see cost of living increases for whatever these services are, we're cutting them back.
Right.
Do you see that?
Wait, cutting back what?
Well, when do you get to the point when the public starts to feel the pain?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Of the government, the debt that the United States has.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you asked this. We didn't rehearse this. This is something I've been thinking about since we started talking, because when I was talking earlier about Fed funds rate at 0.
I'm clairvoyant.
That's
how I know the...
Right, but the reason I brought that up is the reason I think we're not going back to 0, first of all, it's not good policy, economic policy. But in addition to that, there's going to be pressure on that Treasury rate, I think, going forward because of the debt. Our federal debt's now over $25 trillion. We're currently on pace. We're adding $2 trillion a year to that debt. I mean, it's starting to look, parabolic. I mean, it's starting to just get steeper and steeper, the rate of increase.
So when does the public feel that?
I think that we're pretty much there. In other words, I think that in this rate cutting cycle, that there's a point they're going to get to. Maybe they can, I don't know how low they'll get to where you start to feel that pressure with treasuries. And what I'm driving at here is that bond investors are going to say, now, wait a minute, the Fed can cut all they want, but I'm only buying this 10-year bond if you pay me for my risk, because the U.S. debt is looming large, and I'm concerned about it. So I got to have a risk premium And so I don't want to overblow this, right? The U.S. is still the safe haven, the dollar is a reserve currency, and so on. So I'm not saying that's changing. I'm just saying, we're at the point now where it's a big issue, in the next year, 2, 3, as they start to deal with rates. I don't think they'll have the luxury of, going to, say, sub 1% Fed funds rate because of the pressure that will be on the bond rates because of the debt.
But you didn't answer the question.
I didn't.
When does the public really start feeling?
Well, what I mean by this is that the public will feel that because that will also impact the rates that people pay for homes and cars and credit cards. That's what I was driving at. Yeah, thanks for clarifying. So that's why I'm saying what I'm saying is because I do think that we will pay for that in higher rates.
Let's go further in the future. When does it get to the point where the government says we can't provide this service anymore?
Well, that's a great question. We've been talking about the federal deficit and deficit spending our entire lives, probably, right? There have been very few periods of time where it wasn't a big issue every year, and I think we're really close to that point where.
Well, if we were, if you treat it like a household,
right, yeah,
or you treat it like a small business, you can say my debt's this, my income's this.
Right.
You get to a point where you're out of kilter.
If the country were an ordinary household,
making the debt payments,
we would be, back against the wall, paying those 25% credit card rates and maxed out our credit cards. If you want to think about it that way. The reason why I'm sort of hedging on my answer is because you would think, if you look at what's going on in the rate of increase in the debt, and by the way, our annual interest payments on our debt now annualized over $1 trillion a year, okay? And by the way, if you see like a report comes out and it says, well, the annual interest payments we're making right now are like $800 billion a year, well, that's because it's looking back 12 months. If you look at the pace we're on now, the 12-month payment is over $1 trillion.
We can simplify this conversation. Or look at it like a small business or a household.
Yeah.
How much money are we bringing in a year?
Yeah.
Do you know?
I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. I don't. Yeah.
It would be interesting to know how much the government's bringing in.
Yeah, I was just looking at the budget last week, and I don't remember
that. And then
that.
how much they're paying of all the money they bring in.
Okay.
How much is
I
now
can
going to
answer
debt?
your question on that. I don't remember the exact dollar numbers, but I can tell you right now that about 28% of our federal budget is deficit spending. Yeah. So it's not sustainable. Right. And at what point are, foreign countries and other people that buy our debt going to say, hey, we're getting a little concerned about your ability to pay this off?
Let's say you had somebody elected who said, I'm just going to do what's right for this country long term. I'm going to do what's right for your children and their children.
Right.
What would you do to start reversing it? How do you reverse this tremendous debt burden?
Yeah.
What steps do you take for that?
I'm not a federal government expert in all the things, but I think most people would agree there's a lot that we're paying for that aren't really providing a good return on investment.
So a way to do it would be saying, these are all the things we spend money on, and start prioritizing.
Not only that, but think about a company. When a company has to downsize and maybe shift directions a little bit because certain things aren't working and other things are more important. What you do, you don't just necessarily lay off, but you restructure, right? So you might merge some agencies and go, hey, but these are really duplicative.
Well, when a company gets into a situation like this, they cut.
Yeah.
And they try to make themselves more efficient.
Correct. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
And so we have a lot of agencies that don't communicate well, and even though they do a lot of very similar things. And so that would be, one thing I'd love to see people do is to come together and say, hey, we need to trim this thing down. We keep talking about like whether or not we're going to give this much money in foreign aid or whether we're going to give this much for a new domestic social program. But when are we ever going to sit down and talk about all the other things that we spend money on? Back to that interest, for example, by the end of this year, the amount of money we pay on our interest on our debt will be greater than our entire defense budget, annual defense budget. Okay, that should be getting people's attention.
It should.
Right?
It should.
Like, so we talk about, well, do we spend more or less on
Well, let me
fill in the
ask you a
blank?
question about the election. As an economist, a lot of people are of the philosophy they like to see divided government. So, in other words, you can be president, and you can be from this party, and maybe you have the Senate, but you don't have the House.
Right.
Or maybe you have the House and you don't have the, and because that forces compromise, you know?
Yeah.
As an economist, would you see that as a good thing, or would you see it as a good thing where one party comes in and they have a vision and they can do whatever their vision is for the country because they have control of the House and the Senate and the presidency?
Generally speaking, I think divided government is healthy. It's important.
I agree.
And you know, the last time we had a surplus was when Bill Clinton worked with Newt Gingrich in the House, and they came together and compromised, right? And we had both parties working out, and we had, you know, a good thing going. Lasted only a couple years. And really, if you think about it in the grand scheme of things, it lasted longer than that because even when we did go back into deficit spending, it wasn't just, you know, crazy like the place we're at right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
You and I are going to be talking at a conference.
Yes.
And what you're talking to me about?
Are we talking about later this week?
In October.
In October.
Yeah.
Yes. You know, I have so many presentations on my schedule between now and then. I think I'm talking about the economy. I think I'm talking about the economy, economic update. Yeah. Talking about TAP.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I believe so. Yeah. In fact, yes, I am. Yeah. And I'm giving an economic update at a conference in San Antonio this Friday.
The legal seminar.
That's correct.
Okay.
And it's a similar deal. Yeah.
Okay.
Economic update.
All right. Well, we always enjoy having you,
Thank
you. You always bring a lot of insight, and that's the great thing about doing the podcast. There's different people that I talk to who do different things, and it's really interesting just to hear their perspective on different things. So I really appreciate you coming up.
Glad to be here.
And that's gonna do it for this episode. Thank you.
Thank you.